Nga Vaka o Kāiga Tapu was Pacific frameworks to address family violence, and 7 Pacific nations were brought together. Samoan, Tongan, Kukiairani, Tokelau, Tuvalu, Fiji and Niue. And since then, a few more, I think Kiribati have also come together to actually put their frameworks together. And we wanted to come together as Pacific to start telling our stories about who we were and why it was important. Our well-being can be elevated when we understand who we are, who we belong to, and all those histories that give rise to being proud in Samoan. Sorry. Much of our work has been about dispelling the myths, changing the stories of who we are, who we have become, according to the foreigners. Samoans are a proud people. We are collective beings. Our strength is in our collectiveness, our faith, our belonging, our ainga, our nuku. And we live to ensure our people are well, physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, and economically. The 7 ethnic communities gathered to talk about how we were going to address family violence using our concepts, our specific knowledges. They're independent worldviews and bodies of knowledge that are unique to each ethnic group. They contain concepts and values that protect and strengthen family well-being. So we'd been, Pacific Island Safety and Prevention Project, who was a part of, actually had been doing this work for some time. And we knew that we were doing things differently. We knew there was the outcomes, or the people were saying to us, something's different about, the woman would say to us, there's something different about our men doing these programs. And we would be like, well, what's different? And firstly, we would just be working with women. We didn't actually work with men. We just started working with women. And the woman came to us and says, well, someone needs to work with our men because we're not leaving them. You know, and they're going to prison and they're coming out of prison and nothing's changed, but we want the violence to stop. And so we decided to actually give it a try. And we started developing programs, and we started talking about what it is we wanted to talk to men about. And what we did know is that too often the stories about us have been always negative. And what we didn't want to be doing with men in these groups was to actually make them go away feeling like they were even worse. We wanted them to actually start thinking about taking responsibility for their breaching of vā. Whāsā more is, and in terms of our well-being, it's important to always think about well-being in terms of, peace, or well-being, peace and harmony are natural states of being to which Samoan people aspire. Nga Vaka o Kāiga Tapu, just thinking about the journey and some of the challenges that kind of came about when we were starting to kind of think about what these programs could look like, or what working with Samoan people could look like. And the challenges to knowledge development, the literature that we identified told us that there was a high prevalence of family violence in Pacific families. Factors unique to Pacific families: inequalities, impact of migration, identity and culture. And some of the challenges were that there was a severe paucity of critical Samoan literature on the relationship between Samoa and family violence. There's an assumption that Pacific peoples are a homogeneous group. So very often people would say, oh, we want you to come here to speak to this Pacific family, and I'd go along and it'd be a Tongan family. And I didn't speak Tongan. We were from different islands with different beliefs and understandings. But there was this assumption that actually I could speak to them, that our language was the same. There's the absence of Samoan Indigenous worldview and contemporary Samoan context. There's poor translations led to misinterpretation of concepts and principles. So there would be all these concepts being thrown out, like wha'aloalo, and the English word for wha'aloalo is respect. Wha'aloalo actually talks about not disrespect, but a way of being, the tone of my voice, the way I stand, the way I speak. So when we're doing these Nga Vaka or Kāiga Tapu with it, tō whāmamao, which is the Samoan framework, we took a strengths-based approach. The core concepts and principles within the philosophical worldviews define and govern relationships between people, and in particular, vātapuia, sacred boundaries of relationships between family members. Correct interpretations and practices of concepts and principles ensure that violent attitudes and behaviour are transformed and well-being is preserved and restored. There are diverse pathways to ending family violence and violations, and these are informed by Samoan concepts and principles. Relational beings and relational worlds. Tō whāmamao reflects the philosophical world of Samoan people, which is premised on wā, interdependent and interconnectedness spaces that relate. The mental, spiritual, physical realms that constitutes the whole Samoan being. Relational nature of language and ritual. Relationships between people based on status and covenant defined by genealogy. Concept of vātapuia, relational spaces embodied in covenants and are sacred to gods and divinities within relationships with all family members. Factors that undermine the relational self, identity and culture. Superficial English translations of ethnic Pacific concepts result in the distortions of their original meanings. Translations level concepts and principles to common meanings. Secularize spiritual concepts, compartmentalize interdependent human realms through an emphasis on behavior over spiritual and mental realms. Racial labeling, stereotyping, Pacific, Pan-Pacific, Pacific, Pan-Pacific, Pacific Islanders. Another factors highlight interdependent concepts as independent notions. Separation of violence and violation. Some of the key findings Samoans in terms of when we had these discussions amongst Samoan communities. Samoa is the philosophical framework within which violence and violations in Ainga is to be understood and addressed. There are no beliefs or practices in Samoa that condone violence and violations against family members. Violence is violations of covenantal relationships. It affects perpetrators, victims, their families, and communities of belonging, everyone. Ainga is the site where vātapuia is preserved and protected. Violations of vātapuia creates terror, suffering, and dysfunction on Ainga. well-being, harmony, and peace is disrupted and fractured. So the framework was also kind of was to inform and to we're hoping to be able to develop training for practitioners, and the principles that inform practitioner practice in terms of the Samoan framework is the tōwhā mamao, which is the critical wisdom and vision of ainga and communities. Wā tapuia, sacred spaces and covenantal relationships between family members. Whaasinomanga, reference points that direct an individual to places and people who are sources of their identity and belonging. Whaia, genealogical connections and kinship ties by affinity. Whaaloalo, behaviour and language that honour wā relationships. Aia tatau, rights of all Samoan people to be respected according to Whaasamoa. And Whaasamoa is, the English translation would be the Samoan way, but actually tikanga, we would say this just kind of fits in with like when you talk about tikanga, we talk about Whaasamoa. Yeah. The gender culture dialogue. Gender and Whaasamoa are interdependent. They cannot be separated. Male and female relationships are defined by Whaasamoa. Brother and sister covenant is the most sacred of all relational covenants. Obligations and responsibilities to this covenant last the lifetime of the brother and sister. So there's a covenant in Samoa, which is whiangainga. And whiangai means to, so whiangainga, if we were to break this word up, whiangai is to be opposite, but actually it's also to be opposite, but to support and to ensure balance and harmony. And whiangainga is the covenant between brother and sister. And the brother to ensure that his sister is always looked after, is always well, and to ensure that that well-being is physically, spiritually, and mentally, that his sister is always held in the highest regard. And so it's not, so whiangainga isn't just about the relationship between brother and sister, but also in terms of men and women's relationships. Breaches in gender, cultural relationships are likely to occur when relationships are redefined by misinterpretations of concepts and principles, or by Western social norms and religion. Sorry. So when, in terms of the Nga Vaka o Kāiga Tapu frameworks, the beauty of all of this was actually being able to bring our people together to talk about us and to tell our truths, to not have to think about ourselves in terms of doing this work, in terms of a funding or a piece of legislation. What we were learning was that actually the pieces of legislation were stopping us from actually doing the work. So the legislation was actually stopping us from coming together to talk together, to be able to come up with solutions that actually were going to ensure our well-being as Samoans. And this has been the essence of the Nga Vaka o Kāiga Tapu frameworks for our people, is actually how do we ensure well-being for our people, for our peoples. I hope that's just the start. I'm just looking at the time. That's a start to, in regards, sorry. Oh, sorry, yes. I'm just aware of the time there, Leonie. How are we doing?
No, we're good, Bets. If you want to spend about 10 more minutes, and thank you for turning the computer just a little fraction. You had these like Pacific light rays flooding all over you, which is actually quite amazing. But yeah, if you want to do another 10 more minutes, then we'll open to questions.
Okay, so when we and when I think about the journey in terms of Nga Vaka or Kāiga Tapu, I think about too often had we been told that we couldn't work with our people in a particular way. We couldn't have men and women in the same room. And we understood the thing around safety and, you know, the pieces of legislation to keep women safe from violence. But we also understood that actually if women were wanting to come and talk with us, and actually they wanted to meet about and tell us what was happening, but they wanted to actually the men to hear. The way in which we kind of held these sessions with the men is that we would have men and women in the facilitating these groups. And at one stage, people were saying that we couldn't. The men would say to us, "Oh, you know, we shouldn't really have women in facilitating these groups or in the groups," and we'd be asked, "Why not?" And they'd say, "Well, we don't want to be talking about these things in front of our sisters." And we'd be like, "Okay, but it's okay for you to soli le va," as we would say. So va in Samoan language are spaces. Va tapuia or va paia are sacred spaces. Yeah. And as Samoans, our destinies are predetermined from the time we are conceived. And so there's the spaces we share with our brothers are sacred. Well, actually, spaces that we share with different people. So men would say, actually, it's not okay to have women in these spaces. And so we would deliberate about that and say to them, but it's okay for you to dishonor the women. So by having us in the room, you see us, you see the women that you have been dishonoring. And it became part of the conversation, but part of the healing, but also part of the wanting to, not about blaming, but to understand what it is that we had been doing. We'd been so far removed from being Samoan and not really believing or understanding that. And so some of the great things about actually getting together with community, which were like church ministers, they were matais, they were women, young people, in these sessions of when we were trying to talk about the frameworks, is that they would actually ask questions. We would ask questions as the New Zealand-born Samoans of our elders. And initially they were like, actually, just listen to us and this is the way it is. But through the time, when this took over a period of months and maybe even to a year, and we'd had these conversations where we ended up just talking about Samoa, where we asked the questions about Christianity and the way in which Christianity has impacted us. Our people couldn't think. They couldn't think to speak about what happened before Christianity. And so we had to frame up the questions and actually ask about, so what does Samoa say? And then there was a natural flow of conversation. This is an ongoing piece of work. The frameworks have been an ongoing piece of work. Lots of people have picked up the framework and actually have used it in the way that they feel they can use it. The concepts it's been useful in that actually people have been able to take the concepts, learn more about ourselves, learn more about the concepts and actually how they inform our tikanga o our whai Samoa. I'm not sure, there has been a training program that has been devised by, I think Ministry, this is the other thing that's happened, is that the Ministry of Social Development who funded this piece of work have, like at the end of the day, they get to decide who they're going to fund, right? At one stage, different people were saying to us that we couldn't use these frameworks, and we turned around and said, actually, they belong to us. This does not belong to any part of the state. These belong to Samoans, to any of the people who actually, any of those ethnic groups, and that we wanted it to be available for anyone to pick up and use. It's the beauty of it for myself in particular is that it's had me think about it's just a different way of doing things, and it's been a challenge, lots of challenges. I've had this hard kind of thinking about what violence is and how, you know, how we should be dealing, how we should be addressing it. But the wonderful thing about actually having sat down with communities and talking this through is that I've learned we are so able to do this within the community. Our people know what it is that we need to be doing, and it's not about punitive processes. They're about actually how do we set ourselves up about who we are. How do we change the stories about ourselves? Because in this country, the stories about us are not good, you know? And so it's about how do we change the stories? How do we talk about ourselves in terms of who we represent, in terms of our families, in terms of our ancestors, in terms of where we come from. And there was the other things that we were kind of learning also that we didn't know. We knew that much. We thought we knew a lot. We actually knew that much. And it's and so this has been ongoing for many of us who have been part of this process and coming together to develop Nga Vaka o Kāiga Tapu. We continue to learn, we continue to do, and we don't just use this conceptual framework just for addressing domestic or family violence. We can pick it up and use it to do any work in our communities. And that's also been the other great thing about it. Okay. All right. Sorry. My phone's gone dead, so I had some notes that I was talking about. My phone, but it's gone dead. I'm happy to answer any questions. It's been a while since I've been involved in actually what's kind of continued with the Nga Vaka o Kāiga Tapu frameworks themselves. But I do really want to give a shout out to you know, the people who have continued to develop them, to add to them, and to our people who continue to support them. Yeah.
Okay, so we've got we've got a couple of questions in the Q&A, and I'd just like to encourage people to put your questions into Q&A. We have two from Emmy Lynn, and they're both related. So one is, has there been a scope within your work to work with queer whānau? And then added to that, is this covenant considered fractured or broken when a sibling transitions? Have you had any experience or advice following siblings who are in the situation that protects culture and gender? So we're talking both about queer whānau, but also when you're talking about the brother-sister covenant, I'm thinking that's what Evelyn is talking about. If someone is transitioning, in terms of a trans person transitioning, how do you see that covenant then
Can I see that covenant
operating? Yeah.
Well, for Samoa also, like there's when we think about well-being and we think about harmony, peace, this is the state of being. In Samoa, we have, like in terms of gender, we have many genders, not just, there's, and the gender is whakawhine and whakawhatama, that kind of sit along also being men and women, te maitai and te māloa. I think we've done what we have done work in terms of the LGBTQI community, but also in terms of the not specifically around this, but I know whānau that have, and it has taken a conversation to sit down and actually talk about, again, who we are, not in terms of like just being the gender we are, but actually who we are in terms of Samoans, and the whole thing around sacredness of, it's a sacred, the transitioning, in terms of when we think about transitioning, that in itself should be seen as a sacred transition. And so Christianity has had a huge impact on how we address or how we speak to different things. So no, I can't, they've been hard conversations, they haven't been easy ones at all. But I think there are ways in which we can have those conversations in Samoan. And this is the other thing about language. When we speak Samoan, and people say this to me, but you should speak Samoan all the time. I go, why? And they say, your tone is different. When you speak English, you sound angry. And I've actually listened to myself, but I think, actually, I do sound angry when I speak English. But there's something in the tone and the nuances of language and how we, if we just are to treat all spaces and everything sacred, then actually there's a different way of having, the conversations are different. And we then also comes with it is this spirit of actually how to talk through things. It's not easy, like I'm going to say, we haven't done any work in around the transitioning, or I suppose you're talking about the brother-sister covenant as well, Leonie, was that the question? Yeah. So that covenant, in terms of sisters, and we have places, we know our places, whether they're in our families or in our, in terms of, like our brothers and sisters, that the spaces are they're really clear. We don't go into our brothers' spaces. Our brothers don't come into ours, right? We don't share the clothes. We don't share each other's clothes. And the whole thinking around that when we ask our people around it is, actually, we don't actually share other people's clothes either. And that's about what you take on when you take on other people's, I'm just trying to think of the English word. Can't think of it. When you take on people's spirits, I suppose, or but anyway, no, I can't say that we've actually done any kind of work. I think there's more work to be done around the whole area of in terms of transitioning, but also in terms of sisters. And so we have a hierarchy that actually is it comes like matai, and then you have your elders. So all the people that kind of hold status is your elders, your matai. you're titled and untitled. The church only recently has been brought into the circle of chiefs. Well, actually they don't, they sit on the outside. The church is here and the village is here, and the matais are here. Yeah, so I think there's a process for talanoa in terms of anything that we think. I don't think it's believed to actually be a breach either, but depending on actually where people sit in terms of in the Christian world, there might be a difference in the thinking.
Kia ora, Betty. I mean, you know, clearly when you're talking about concepts like Waka Tapu in those, you know, the space of those kind of sacred spaces, which we would have in terms of tapu, that also links into the spaces that we move in and out of as descendants, you know, as mokopuna, as, you know, in our own lives as well. And that was a really great question. Thank you for that. Helen Lee has written in the Q&A, I mean, generally she's talking about he waka i whenua as a call to unity and kotahitanga. It's about a common kaupapa, not being a one size fits all, because there are unique roles that people have. So, and her pātai is, how important is it in the Waka o Kāiga Tapu that within the diversity of the unique Pacific frameworks, there's also a recognition of diversity within each framework as well. So our own diversity is within our own people.
It's so important. There are so many similarities, but there are so many differences. But even in terms of being Samoan, each village has its own tapu or have their own belief systems. And I think it, you know, in order to understand, I can be a Samoan that comes in and actually thinks I can hold court or session with people, but unless I understand the depthness of Samoa, I can only do so much. I can only have if I don't have the language, I don't understand the depthness of some of the of much of Samoa. Each of the ethnic groups were really clear about the things that they wanted to that they needed to be doing in their groups and with their people, and lots of those things in terms of how we have the conversations, in terms of covenants, lots of them were different, and in terms of Samoans, we were able to use those covenants to actually address some of the issues within some of those programs that we'd set up for men and women. Yeah, it's so important. I think the diversities of each of those groups is such an important thing. We're not the same. We're not homogenous. We're not, but we are, and we are. We know what it is that we need to be doing in those separate groupings as well, communities.
Ka pai, I'm going to get you to turn your camera again a little bit. So Deepika has asked a question in terms of and covenant relationships that can help define whanaungatanga responsibilities and respect between whānau members. Can you talk about the concept of covenant relationship and the restoration of these relationships in our Indigenous whānau communities?
Well, violence is a violation of different tapu for us, you know, sacredness and so sacredness. The covenant between brother and sister, when violence occurs, if you know, most of the violence that occurs in terms of domestic violence. Now this is a bit difficult because when we're talking about family violence, what's being talked about is domestic violence, what's happening between men and women a lot, and men being the perpetrators of violence and the women being victims. And so as soon as there's violence, men perpetrating violence against women, there's been a violation of that sacredness. Sorry, Leonie, what was the question again?
No, I think you're answering it. It's about, you know, I guess it's
the restoration.
The restoration of those relationships.
Yeah. So like so again, I talked earlier about the VAR, and when we breach those, that sacred space, it's called soli le VAR. And then there's a way by which we talk about restoring that sacredness, and it's still le VAR. We have to still le VAR, and we do everything possible. We bring in whoever we need to bring in to ensure that harmony is restored and peace is restored. Yeah.
A couple more questions in the Q&A, Betty. When you have both men and women in the session, was it a counselling session or a mediating? What's the aim of bringing men and women together in the sessions, and how has that been achieved?
Well, for a long time, we were just doing women's work, and we were just working with women. We weren't working with men at all. And so women were saying, actually, like I said, someone needs to work with our men, right? And so we started doing the work with men, and then we went really we're doing women's work over there, we're doing work with men over here, but we weren't bringing them together. Actually, if I can say, prior to being funded for this work, we did whānau work. It was, we did work, but that's how we operated. There was no one telling us we couldn't do it that way, right? That's just the way we did it. And it wasn't until we kind of took on a contract that the state started stipulating that we couldn't have men and women, the perpetrators and victims, in the same space. That's what they're saying. So what it did was that it kind of stopped us from doing the work in the way in which we needed to be doing it.
I'm sorry.
In order to not break the whatever it is, the law, we were doing the work separately, but what we ended up doing was, and we actually brought them together as whānau. Once we'd finished the 20 sessions, once we had done the blah, blah, we brought them back together, because actually that's what we needed to do. And actually that's what the whānau were asking for. But we also had this analysis around safety and, how do we ensure safety for women and children? How do we ensure that we're not forcing them into a situation where they're having to come in and face, or talk to someone they didn't really want to talk to? We were aware of all of those things, and making sure that women got to define a lot of that kind of, how that kind of worked. Women as victims. But most of the time, the work was done with both, with the whānau. Had better outcomes.
Kia ora, Bets. So Chris, Ramsey and Tūtama Wahine is saying, my pātau is the influence of assimilation upon us men is ongoing, that permeates through our pores every day of our lives. How do we go back to our ancestral values when all the systems we live under prevent us from practicing those values?
And these are the ongoing, and this is an ongoing kind of learning. We're still trying to find, we don't have the answers. We are trying different things in different ways. We have, one of the things we do know is that when we're in a space of Samoans and we speak Samoan and we are engaging in the Samoan way, the responses are ones of actually our men taking responsibility, feeling ones are where they are actually feeling, they talk, and also because they have their sisters, they're challenging them or speaking to them. That in itself, there's a whole thing about shame and how we deal with shame, but also how do we hold each other accountable. I think there's a whole process of accountability where we've actually used whānau as the basis for accountability, to where we continue to hold our people accountable. And when we talk about, like in terms of men, there's so, there's this whole kind of space where they actually come in and where they feel so powerless. Our people feel so powerless. And so the little power that they do have, when we've kind of talked about what the hell happens, or what is it that you're doing, and this is the power that they have, and it's whether it's their physical power, because violence is a power over, and they talk about that. What we've been able to do is actually then talk about actually their responsibilities as brothers, as fathers, as husbands, as men. And that actually they're not the heads of the houses, like there's this whole thing about them being the heads of the family, and that actually what that actually means, and having conversations. So they're ongoing conversations, and then they don't end at the 20-week program. Those conversations are ongoing, and we have to create spaces for us to continue having those conversations with each other. And they're conversations where we're having conversations, not having just big blowouts with each other. Yeah, it's ongoing. I don't have a I do it, like it's not just in the program. I do it with my brothers. I do it with my uncles.
Right. I mean, that question really opens up, Betty, some of the discussions that we've been having in He Waka Eke Noa about the impact of state violence, institutional racism, systemic violence, and how that transgresses and disrupts relationships. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, the impact of the kinds of state violence? Yeah.
So we come from, so this is another thing that we do, like in terms of, we come from Samoa, and we hold status in our homelands, right? As the elder, or as the mother, as the sister, as the father, as the brother, and we all hold status, some kind of status, matai status. And then we come here, and unless you're a church minister, you can be a matai, but you actually don't have your village. You can be a matai, and actually we've set up our churches as our villages, but they are not. It's not the same, because you don't have your puyainga, your family have now become all the whāngai Samoans who have come together, and so my matai is just in my village. My matai, I don't go next door and actually say, actually, this is how we're going to run things here. They'll tell me, who the hell do you think you are? And so, so when we come here, there's such a breakdown of who we are and what we can be. And we go into, and then we go into these jobs, and again, we have these bosses, like it just reminds me of the overseer, like being in the plantation, and we're like, who are we? We're just we're the people who have these kind of overseer bosses who keep telling us what to do. And I remember growing up and just thinking, our parents saying to us, or my mother saying to us, you just put your head down, and you just, you don't want any trouble, right? Whereas my father was something, he'd be saying that don't be afraid. Like that's not okay that they treat you that way. And so we had kind of two parents who were really different. And then I come, and then I'm like, actually none of this is okay. And what I learned very early was that by disrupting or by challenging, I was always in trouble. Our people don't like being in trouble. They like keeping the peace. And so what do they do? What we end up doing? We end up becoming, we end up believing what we've been told about ourselves. It's colonized. We become so colonized, right? And in a way, it's a way of actually surviving.
Yeah.
But also it becomes also what it does to us, it actually creates this anger. That's that, you know, and the anger we take out on the ones around us.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I remember you talking, Betty, once around how you did the graduation of the program to bring people together as a kind of collective. And is that kind of, I'm hearing you talk about village, and I've heard you talk about the way in which within the various villages and Samoa, you negotiated and people were made collectively responsible to each other and accountable to each other.
Yeah.
So do you want to talk a little bit about that collective accountability and how you then practice that, particularly when you talked about the graduation from the project program?
Yeah, so we'd have this program at the end of the programs, 16-week program. We'd have a graduation for all the men that did the program, and the graduation would be over food. We'd actually, and it'd be up to like 500 people at the graduation. So all their families, we'd invite all of their families to come along, the children, and also the state agencies that actually had some part in actually referring them to us. And we were seeing it as we've finished this program with these guys now. Community have to take some responsibility, and their whānau have to, in terms of holding them accountable. And in a way, at first people were saying, actually, it's not okay. You're kind of, what's the word? Reaching their, it was unethical, they were saying.
Their privacy?
Yeah, there's privacy around, you know, and though for us, that's our way. That's the Samoan way. Everyone gets to know. We don't have walls in our houses. Everyone knows when there's a fight next door in the house. You know, and so we were creating that again, recreating actually community about accountability, and so we would people would get up and speak, and we were thinking, how do we know whether this has worked or not? How do we know whether this 16-week program is of any use? And the children would get up and speak at the graduations and say, our daddy doesn't yell at us anymore, or our daddy takes us to the park, and we'd be like sitting there. The men would get up and they'd speak and they'd cry, and it was like such an emotional, you know, like it was, and it wasn't like a put on thing. It was actually people being really grateful and just, you know, like and the men would turn up and they'd go, "Oh, that's my minister. What is he doing here?" You know, just the minister of the church, and oh God, that's my uncle. Who invited him? And so this would just be community turning up to this graduation. And so really that what they knew was that people were going to be aware of the fact that they'd come into this program, they'd been violent, and actually now your family are going to take care of you. And it was such a wharelenga. The process is such a overwhelming kind of, I don't know the English. I don't know English word. Sorry.
I'm cognizant of time, and we need to close up in just a moment. But Betty, one of the things that, you know, and this is such a great session, thank you. But one of the things, you know, that I said at the beginning is that when we first saw the Nga Vaka Kāiga Tapu frameworks that you know, you and I talked about Aotearoa not being part of the Pacific nation, and also, you know, that you have walked alongside and been a part of so many movements, you know, in this country, right? For Māori treaty movements, land movements, you know, family violence prevention movements, LGBTQI, Indigenous, Takatapui, all of those. How important is it for you that we as Māori and all of our Pacific relations across the Pacific come together in our own terms, not in this kind of colonizing term of Māori and Pacific people, but in our own terms?
That's what we should be doing. If we were to honour our Samoanness, we're here in Aotearoa. Aotearoa is, we should be coming to you, and actually we should have this relationship where we're talking to each other about, honouring the fact that we're on your land. It's what someone in the village next door would do. They'd come next door to us and we'd go to someone else's place, we'd go in there respectfully, actually not assuming that we have a right to be there. And so the same should apply. It doesn't matter whose country, where we are in the world. This land, Aotearoa, is part of the Pacific. And we need to change the way we talk about it, because we can't wait for the state or anyone else to. We need to strengthen those relationships with each other to make it different. And, when we talk about what's happening in the Pacific around who's coming in to the Pacific, I think we should be talking to each other about how we, Samoa's maybe in so much debt to maybe China or something. Well, why aren't, we're probably having to sell off some of our land. Why aren't we selling it to iwi Māori? Why aren't we having those discussions? Why is it that we should be? It's so important that we actually recognise and acknowledge Indigenous peoples, and here in Aotearoa, Māori. There's this assumption that actually what's happening in New Zealand is great. And I keep saying to people, you want to actually have a measure. If Indigenous people were the measure of what great is, that'd be a discussion.
Kia ora, Bets. He mahi tēnei ki a koe. And we're looking forward to having you present more in the conference at the end of the year in September when we get together. So just putting you on the spot for that one. Pawhai tai rapa, tēnā koe mō kōrero I tēnei rā. That was amazing, so great to get some insights around the frameworks and to hear your reflections, culturally, politically, socially, across the board in terms of the work that you're doing and that we need to be doing together. So I'm going to hand it to Hiri Aroha to do our closing, karakia, and then, ngā mihi nui from all of the participants who have been online. It was a really exciting and informative and insightful presentation. Tēnā koe. Hiri Aroha.
Tēnā tātai, kei te tautoko ai ngā mihi kia koe e te mārei kura o Hamua e Betty, tēnā I te mihi atu kia koe, tēnā rau atu kōrua. Anā ka hikina tā tātai nei huinga I te karakia. Hikitia te rongo maiwhiti o tēnei o ngā huinga o he waka eke noa. Toko akea ia, toko akea oi, ko ranginui ki runga, ko papatunu ki raro, tūturu whakamaua kia tina, haini e hui e, taiki. Tēnā tātai.
Kia ora, mahalo aptai.